Recording in progress.
According to the computer, because who trusts the cloud? Anyway.
Yeah.
I can tell the difference.
Trust me, that's the
things.
number of weird techie things. Downloading Baldur's Gate and getting it onto my Mac. Oh my God.
Welcome back, everybody. This is a Sharon and Dwight Marvel Cinematic Universe episode, of which there are, who knows? You know what? There's a lot of them we've made, but there's not enough for the world. Yep. I think that's why we owe all of you more to dive in deeper. We've got a couple of things that we're gonna. Well, I was gonna say this is gonna be 2 recordings, but still, a couple of things we're recording on today. We're going to get into echo today. Mm-hmm. We're going to listen to our own echo. That's something a therapist of mine used to say. Listen to your own echo. Let other people listen to their own echo. Sit in your space. Anyway, that's not what the show is about. I just thought I'd just bring that in. It was therapeutic for me, so I'm grateful for everybody listening to it out there. Your earrings are almost X-Men earrings, but they're not quite.
They're actually they're butterflies, and they're done in a local indigenous pattern. So yeah, which kind of works. I didn't even think of that when I put them on this morning. They're from Tika's boutique here in Winnipeg that does all in indigenous artisan stuff.
You're quite involved with a lot of, and it seems to me this goes back to your political career days and things too. You're quite an advocate of local indigenous culture, and I just noticed that you post a lot. It
predates that. It probably starts somewhere in grade 8, where I almost failed to pay, where I had to basically go to the principal about a social studies paper where I was arguing that the local Métis and their leader Louis Riel were misrepresented, because at that point we were still being taught that he was a traitor, and I was like, no, this guy's the founder of the province. So it was nothing better than later on, after becoming a Métis historian, doing beadwork studies and all my stuff there, to end up in politics and then have him actually acknowledged that way. So the legislation we put in place that acknowledged him as, in one way, the next government is now taking it and basically acknowledging him as the first premier of the province or the first governor. So it goes back a long way, and it ties to family, it ties to a whole bunch of things. So indigenous representation has always been really important, because I've seen, I know and love too many people that have been put on the back burner or treated differently, or even had my own experiences where with this group, I'm treated one way, but suddenly if I'm perceived as being part of this other group, whoa, So yes, that's what I love about Echo, is what they've done there. So that we'll be talking a lot about that. Sorry. Long answer.
Very much. No, long form answers are the core of our Marvel episodes. Mm-hmm. Long form feelings. I got a lot of feelings that branch off from this one too. That I was thinking about lots of different sort of cinematic things that they are. I think that Marvel does the best when they pick a genre of film or a genre of story, and then they put one of their characters into it. Right. Mm-hmm. I heard years ago, it was the director, and I should prep this or vamp just for a second, of the movie Slight. It's an independent movie that I don't know if anybody's heard of it or seen it. I would suggest it. It was a Sundance movie here in Utah that I got lucky enough to go see. Ooh, okay. And the director, J.D. Dillard, that's his name, and he has a writing partner, Alex Theroux. Anyway, sorry, Alex, if I got your name wrong. I'm sure they're both listeners, but the whole it was about a street magician who in the inner city who it gets sucked into some things with like drugs, and Dule Hill actually plays a drug lord, local dealer kind of thing. So if you want to see Gus from Psych or from in a whole different way, then you want to check that out. Anyway, but he was giving some impressions about why he made it this way and how they made choices. And he said I think it's time to have sci-fi and superhero genre type of characters and powers injected into regular stories. And I remember he said, what if, the couple from Revolutionary Road developed superpowers, for example? That was his kind of approach to it. And so this was one where, I'll just put it out there. People can go see Slight if they want. I would recommend it. But anyway, just to kind of see, so when Marvel picks a storyline, and in this case, this is not only is it like a crime fiction, it also has overtones of kind of the vengeance genre, just a little. And then also, and this is a very specific thing, I'm naming this, the tough warrior person comes back home or to a community that needs them, and then does something.
The returning home, finding the roots, and then either the unexpected or the oh god no, the whole reason. I mean, we weren't thrilled. You were gone, and that meant the trouble was over there.
Yes. And you can see elements of that in lots of different type of. I mean, it goes back to the Seven Samurai, warriors coming in and helping, High Plains Drifter kind of stuff, the Limey. I'm just going to list through many of those things. There was a terrible one that starred The Rock. Anyway, whatever. There was all these kinds of stories that have this kind of justice overtones and often involve someone who comes from the local community coming in to kind of save the day, and yet not tropey. Right. At least I didn't feel like there were certainly some things that they followed, but I thought that they did the story justice in that it was its own type of story. And I'll be honest, different than I thought from the previews. A lot more soul and heart and heritage that was built into it.
Well, and I think that's what I liked as well, because, I mean, yes, it had a rating that is not, usually safe for the likes of Deadpool, let's just say. And yes, it does obviously, again, dips into the world again of Daredevil, which again tends to be a little, rougher than a lot of the other shows.
Realistic. I mean, we'll get it. Not really realistic.
The grittier rather than the laser beam kind of, stuff. It's the and again plays on that notion of too. Again, thinking of Daredevil, there's someone where no sight, but how does he manage? Well, this is this idea of who Echo is and where it fits in. And I think what I loved about it was it still had that grittiness. It did did go down a lot more of that whole thing with Kingpin. And again, D'Onofrio is always rocks that role. And
just seeing him be Kingpin is worth, that's
worth the price of admission right there. Yeah. and so what I loved was that combination of the vengeance, but then also how you see how it ties into other things and how it ties into the family past, and it ties into these things that still, literally have ties back into the community. And I think that's another part too, that we, it gives us that opportunity to explore, is that marginalized communities. And we see this in other parts, and again, gets represented in the MCU in different ways, but that idea of marginalized communities end up getting sucked into things that are, not necessarily what would be their go-to, because they're on the margins. It's the way to cope. And then you get people from the outside with the proverbial, why don't those people make better choices? And you're like, well, when your choices are two different, this is not about good over evil or the greater of two goods. You've got crappy and toxic and different crappy and toxic in some cases. And so that idea, which is again something that ties into a lot of stereotypes, both throughout North America regarding Indigenous people and how we've marginalized them, and then wondering why.
Yes.
Certain things. So, I mean, they had the nod to even things like here's the casino, and that kind of thing. They did a brilliant job with the powwows. Really happy to see so many jingle dresses and grass dancers, but that's later, spoiler alert. So no,
as always, really if you've never listened,
really good about family.
Yeah. Oh, and that's a strength they brought into a few. Real quick, I'll say, if you've never listened to one of our Marvel episodes, this is spoiler laden. We're not gonna, because in order, really, the purpose of the reason we do these on this show is because, well, let's be honest, it's fun. But the real reason, the way it fits really well, I don't, come at me if you want, everybody, but it fits really well into the theme of this show, psychology and culture, is that we're analyzing some of the elements socially, psychologically, some of those things that come up in these stories, of which there are a lot. And so therefore we kind of have to get into the weeds of some of these things. So I will say, if you haven't watched it and if you care about spoilers, although, did you know there's some research that indicates that spoilers for most people do not minimize or do not reduce the amount of enjoyment people have. And in some cases, people enjoy things more after knowing what's going to happen. Anyway, kind of interesting. I don't
we're the nerds that would look that up. Psychologically, what's the impact of my reading the last page of the murder mystery?
Yeah, exactly.
Or reading that review before I walk into the theater and finding out whether, what happens to the main character.
And
I think that's the other part of it too. And this is another one in terms of that whole history. It gives a good, again, for a snapshot, and the way they've done it episode by episode based on different ancestors, a really good colonial history, and which in its own way represents, again, the intergenerational trauma, the kinds of things that have happened. And I think that's, again, the other part. Oh gosh, again, back to my teaching days and the number of times you would give examples of something and it would be like, okay, so you seem to understand this. If I talk about family X that had this, and here was, grandpa's, self-medication that led to this. So I can explain it to you in terms of this genealogy of even just 3 or 4 generations of one family. Now take that and expand it out, not just to a family, but take it to a community, and then a community over close to 500 years. And it's like, okay, if you can get it over 3 or 4 generations, do the math and then wonder why things are the way they are, and almost be surprised that they're not even worse in light of what you're able to do. So I think that was another thing too, and it dealt with a lot of that healing as well. I have to say that as a Canadian, in terms of, again, Indigenous representation, oh my God. So like to see Tantu Cardinal and Graham Greene as effectively the grandparents, those are literally, as a Canadian growing up and having seen them in a variety of things, like they are literally like grandparents of my life. And to see those two, I mean, they were that old bickering couple. Well, they're not, they've kind of split up, and like, you just like, oh, just the warm fuzzy. Like there was a whole coming home where he's like, you couldn't have cast that better. But the way they played those roles so well, especially in terms of it being a matrilineal culture, which is the other part that I like. I think it screwed up some viewers, where it's the whole, her name is Maya Lopez. And it was like, that means there's, and it's not denying the Latina identity, but those are names from dad's side of the family. And dad is of Indigenous and Latina, background there. This is about her maternal ancestry and what's coming through the maternal, which is the Choctaw. And so I think initially when it first came out, it was like, well, what the heck? What is she? Well, she's like a lot of folks that have been displaced and this, that, and whatever else, and relocated, Yeah,
and it works in a way of complication, because I feel like one of the main sort of messages, if we want to say, is family. What is family? There's a big element of that, right? And so that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it, because I guess I kind of just went along with it to know, I mean, culturally, some of the intertwining of just, so I hadn't really thought about that, and that aspect of it, but that adds even another layer, because you've got, obviously, right, this adoption kind of thing as Kingpin has took over in her life, which, I mean, you could say, is there just a subtle nod to colonialism there? You kind of a thing of like, here's this guy who feels I can come in and take possession, in this case, of a person, which, well, actually, never mind. Well, that still works.
Well, and also the idea of, I'm going to kill off your family, but then I'm going to replace them.
Absolutely.
You think about it, like this guy is like, and you think of most of the major deaths in her family.
Yeah.
Yeah, they all come back to the guy that's trying to play dad.
Well, and I couldn't help.
Holy.
Yeah. When he says we have the shared experience, our fathers were both murdered, and it's like, well, I mean, yeah, they were also murdered by the same guy, you.
Yeah.
And for those who hadn't seen Daredevil,
on when he's handing her the hammer, you're like, wow, like if you want like literally the physical symbolic representation of passing on toxic coping tools from one generation to the other, pass on the murder weapon.
Well, and for anyone who's seen the Netflix series Daredevil, obviously, I felt like one of the more powerful episodes in that is the one for, if you haven't seen it, there's this episode where Kingpin wakes up every morning and it shows him going through his routine of going in his immaculate closet and picking out, his tie tack for the day and his pinky, whatever it is, all that stuff. But he wakes up every morning and he stares at this painting that is essentially a sort of a grayish off-white with a grayish off white with a kind of a pattern to it, just a rough pattern.
It's textured, but it's not an image. Yeah.
And it goes into where he got this from, and you have these flashbacks of him waking up as a child, and we do see this in Echo at the end, where he's watching this damaged plaster wall getting impacted by his father physically attacking and being violent with his mother. And then the capstone of that episode is where we see his emotional sort of trigger backstory, villain origin story, where he takes a ball peen hammer and kills his father.
Yeah.
It's engineered in such a way we definitely don't feel, I don't feel bad for his father in that scene, but what you do is you feel some humanity around him and around that little kid. Right. Who felt that's where I have to
and what he's had to do to heal, and again that sort of, again, he's another marker of that intergenerational stuff happening, where he was in a lousy place, he did this, look what he turned into. And again, that idea that when you think about somebody who plays a villain or an anti-hero, it's usually what's the fork in the road, what's the thing that turned them into this. And yeah, that sort of, there's a level of empathy in some sense that it's like he should never have been exposed to that. No child should be. And then, there's nothing, again, not going to get into the morality of, what he did in terms of, criminal law versus whatever. Like he was trying to save his mother, save himself. It's what he does afterwards. And so there's like, it's one thing when it becomes, you can argue self-defense. And then it's okay, but what did you do afterwards? And if you go build an empire again, parallels Magneto, this idea of, well, now I'm going to just perpetually be on the offensive so that I never have to be on the defensive. And the victim becomes the bully, so to speak. So I think that's what's interesting, is that you see how, especially getting the backstory on her and how they wove the story in and how they started showing, again, the different family members. And the part that's interesting about this is that everybody, again, and it creeps out, so it's, how does, her father, William, deal with it, how he brings her there, the issues with her grandmother, how Chula doesn't know what to do. And again, it's all tied to the father. And even notions of estrangement and how there are sometimes we keep distance, but, what's a healthy distance versus what's I got to talk to somebody and get over my own stuff. So that was the other part, is you watch Chula and that whole growth process of her, the grandmother, and even again, the loss of her mom. And, tangent here I'll go off on later, but, that's a Manitoban. That's Katarina Ziervogel from Saugeen First Nation. And so, and she's known as a director and a theater performer here. So she doesn't, weirdly, somebody's got to write a Wikipedia page about her, because she's the only actor that's kind of like from the main cast that's not there. And out of all the Canadians there, as a local girl, I want to see her on the interwebs. But yeah, like that role of her mother. And it's how this whole, like, she does come home, and as much as she brings all this crap home in some respects, that's also where it all gets sorted out. And that's where you see how real family copes. Yes. Like nobody there is looking for the kind of, it's about, we're actually trying to avoid violence, but if we have to put this right and do certain things, then by God, we'll do it. And they go and they stand up, and you see that. So it's, again, ironic. You got literally the white colonizer, dude in his white suits, right?
Absolutely.
Just coming in with all the toxic and the violent and the whatever.
I was waiting for the white suit in the end, but we stayed gray. So, yeah. Yeah. So it's that sort of symbolic representation that he has, in terms of, again, comics and whatnot. But yeah, to see these, again, the indigenous community come together in a way where it's like, well, we've known about this, we've had to deal with it, we're still kind of glommed into it, but we deal with it at arm's length so that it doesn't bring the garbage home. Like, how much do we need to be involved? But at the same time, because we got to bring money in, we got to do this, we got to do that. And at the same time, not have the blood and the dirt on our hands. Mm-hmm. Okay, now dude is bringing this home. Okay, it stops here. It's an issue of direction of the energy, direction of aggression, direction even of violence that you can see there. One of the things that it culminates in is this idea, I think, that Kingpin, much like a lot of villains in these kinds of stories, right? There's this sort of justification, and you mentioned Magneto, great example, fighting against things that are truly horrible that non-mutant humans are doing to mutant humans, right? and yet and a victim survivor of the Holocaust in that case. So there's this justification that you can almost be like, wow, yeah, I mean, I kind of, get it. But then the aggression is taken out towards ultimately victimizing other innocent people, right? That's the thing. It's like you can't go out and totally justify that choice. And Kingpin in this case, very much, I think with these toxic patterns, we can see he very much wants to prescribe, let's say, that system of recovery that he also triggered, by the way, not to get away from that. But when her going back to when her father dies, and then he's like, okay, we're going to do the same thing. And you can see it. There's this scene in the alleyway where there's a guy who basically treats her badly because she can't speak, won't sell her an ice cream. As we all know, lethal, capital punishment being what it is for being rude. The guy, and once again, how sorry do we feel? I guess, the guy didn't deserve that.
Well,
anyway.
Exactly. The guy was a jerk, but then the thing is, at the same time,
he killed him, but not, but.
Well, but at the same time, you got D'Onofrio there who's like, I'm going to basically wipe out your family so that I can place myself as your family so that I can then pass this on to you. And that's, again, just like whole levels of wackadoodle there. But the idea that he does this to this other guy because he finds it offensive, and she calls him out at the end. It's you've never once learned how to sign.
Yes.
So it's he had translators, and then, okay, when I'm done with them, what does he do? I mean, there's nothing like walking in, you're like, oh, you see the shot and you're like, okay, yeah, well, not that I didn't suspect it from this cut before, but the hallway's covered in, like, we got a Dexter episode set up here where it's like, the translator, don't walk down the hallway.
Even the interpreter, right?
You see big sheets of plastic.
You got to wonder at what point you're like, this is a hallway full of sheets of plastic that in this crime lord's house that I'm in. Oh, wait. Yeah.
Well, and then he goes down the tech thing where he ends up having the, basically, again, forces a contact lens into her eyes so that he can do this, basically, like a virtual reality signing. So that's the other part is that he never really does the work. He never makes the move. So it's, and again, to me, that's just a total representation of colonization. Oh, look here's all the lip service. So the other part
a toxic
goes into, this is reconciliation. In many respects, this show is a nice little pop culture encapsulation of reconciliation, where in showing this story and telling this thing and using Kingpin, as an example of colonization, and here's putting it right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's, in fact, a toxic, it's a type of affection. It's a type of love, but it is an ownership type of love. You can't treat her that way because she's under my protection. I care for her. I love her. But yet also I own her, right? And I was going to say, I can't help but have the expression pop in my head, if all you have is a hammer. Anyway, in this case, literally, he's showing her, here's what we do. And similar to how we see these kind of toxic patterns, like, it's like, oh, I've got so much affection for you and I'm here to protect you until you become independent and try to do something that isn't what I prescribed, that isn't what I want you to do. And then almost right away, we see us, he's even like, by the way, more forgiving of her shooting him in the face because it's still violence, right? But he's more forgiving of that because he understands that. Whereas when she's like, nah, I don't want anything from you anymore, he's like, that's not okay. Now you have to die, and those you love have to die, and you have to watch. And all this, where it snaps like, oh, I'm the fire-breathing dragon now. I was the loving uncle until now. Yeah.
Well, and that's the other part of it too, is just, again, like, holy trauma bonding kind of stuff. Like, I mean, there's just like the mind games and stuff. And at the same time, it's that whole, but it seems completely logical in his mind, his world. There's nothing weird about it. It's just what you do. So I think that's the other part, where there's these layers of manipulation, yet he would not necessarily see them as consciously manipulative. It's just what you do, because that's how, and again, so you get people to do what you want or what you think is in their best interest or whatever the thing is. But it's wild. But when you look at her character, I mean, I think it's brilliant. One of the things I do like about the coming home aspect of it is that we've seen her in terms of, again, being out there, being in that other world, that, the stone, the concrete, the tracksuit mafia, that kind of thing. And it is about her skill set. And they really didn't go into superpowers per se. And
just a little, right.
Yeah, just a little bit, but it wasn't like they didn't get into, again, this was where we finally got that origin and backstory. And I think that's by bringing it home the way they did, they were able to play into it a little bit more and actually see, like, what does echo mean? And I think that was the other part of it, was this idea that walking through these different stories and seeing what her genealogy is. And I will have to say that, again, for a, superhero based thing. And yes, they have changed. And that's the other part people need to be aware of, is that some of the origins and the cultural background of the characters have changed. But I think honestly, that fits into the larger reconciliation as well, where it's what works, how do we do these things better, more authentically? And maybe, I hate to say this, but it's sort of almost like dropping the original cultural background is almost like a way of saying we're shedding the colonial baggage that went with this.
Absolutely.
So yes.
The thing that people sometimes don't think about is that these stories were originally told, even though Marvel has always been, people are, they're so woke now. And it's like, well, they've always been.
No, they've always been woke.
They've always been woke in that, whatever, before there was a term for it. There's been more of a progressive in many, and let's just say in many ways. There are several blind spots, obviously, but
the blind spots, but they're starting to acknowledge now. It was well intentioned, but maybe not well executed at the time. Even given that, giving him credit for the time, it's a different time. No, but even giving them credit for the time, we have to acknowledge that these stories were told by white males, right? I mean, originally, and now, so when something comes out like this, and I read something very interesting in the. It's become a little well known amongst the fans, but Sydney Freeland talking, or Freeland, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I haven't heard it said out loud if it's Freeland or Freeland, but also as an indigenous, as a Navajo, filmmaker, and she's worked on Reservation Dogs and all these things. She brings obviously a lot of cred and a different perspective to the story. But in the interview, she says, for her, Echo's power set and skill set in the comics just wasn't enough. And I think she actually used the word her powers were kind of lame, because she has an above average ability to imitate people's fighting skills and powers, and then not powers, but fighting skills. She's like a rogue of martial arts, if you will. And then she retains the ability from there on. And whether or not people want to get into, can you do something good with that? Can you not? Whatever. But it's essentially like she had the same abilities as Taskmaster, so to speak. And so to say, no, we're actually going to give, I thought this was clever too, a small amount of supernatural, but we're bringing this into very much, it's just the same ongoing relationships she has with the family that she comes back and physically that are alive. But there's this heritage there, and she's able to have some sense of powers of healing and some powers of strength, and she's able to imbue her friend and her grandmother with that in the last episode as well. So building on that, it's very much in keeping with this idea of this heritage and this who's my real family, what's my real, and the whole idea of her being an echo of generations past is a whole new thing, because once again she was an echo in the sense of I could fight as good as Black Widow. Mirroring things. Right. Well, and that's what I loved about it, because that's also much more in keeping with indigenous perspectives. There's always and you've got terms like all my relations, and the idea of 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. Like you never decisions are not made based on the here and now. They're made based on the consequences for 7 generations forward. That no one owns anything. You are merely the steward of it, because the real owners have not yet been born. And then also that idea, which again has been very important, in light of what's happened with colonization, is this idea that again, you're tied to your ancestors. For whatever else has happened and whatever has taken you away and all of those different things, you draw power from your ancestry. You draw power. And so the notion, like, this fits into things, that are akin, whether it's a vision quest, the kinds of visions that one gets, going into a sweat lodge, these different kinds of things where it's the voices of the past are there for you. You just have to listen to the message. That kind of thing. So it's physically there with her grandmother. It's there when she has the conversation with her mother later, and that's that healing aspect of it. And the lessons, again, whether it's with the bird, all of these different things, they're there. And this is about that drawing back. And so again, she was in that concrete colonized world before, and in a sense was shut off from it or didn't have full access. She comes back, because that's the other part too, is that there's this idea that we are tied to the land. We are of the land. And so it's that coming back to home and, and that coming back to your people, your community, and that full connection. So I thought it was brilliant. And there were different little things too, where you saw it, for example, even in just like things like the colors of her clothes. When she's in that, we'll call it the New York Daredevil, that kind of, black leather. Back home, you see very dark brown leather.
That's
so
really
they're not changing her aesthetic in some wacky kind of way. She's not, coming back home and suddenly, walking around in a jingle dress all the time. But you just see those slight little nods. You see when Scully makes her the piece for her leg. And the idea that it's got, symbolism, the idea of like wearing your identity, being proud of it.
And even the line where she's like, well, maybe I'll just wear it under my pants. Right? I mean, once again, in that, I didn't think of it that way, but in that analogy you're just bringing up, it's kind of like, do I shield this, or do I, here's this connection. Also, to that point of Kingpin never even bothering to learn sign in the 30 years that he's been her supposed caretaker and only one she can trust. He's willing to kill interpreter. I mean, I don't know how many interpreters are dumped in the the New York.
These people at least made the friggin' effort, dude, in your office.
And every one of her true family and friends, when she comes back, they do, right? They do know sign language, and that. Yeah. And so there's that acceptance level as well, and that understanding that you do run into. The type of storytelling, I read it's a collection, an anthology of short stories, short horror and scary stories around Halloween called Never Whistle at Night. And they're all authors that were indigenous. And the introduction by the editor, I think it's, I looked it up here just to make sure I remember. Shane Hawk is the... Okay. Oh, and here we go. Stephen Graham Jones writes the introduction as well. So there we go. But it's all about how indigenous stories are differently told than, say, especially like in white cultures with their, comparison of, they're not always encapsulated in this way. There's an ongoing nature. At least that's how it's described in this book. I recognize
that would be very much in keeping with what I've been taught and exposed to, and that there's variations and iterations, and it's
a chapter from a larger kind of ongoing sort of story. It was one of the analogies that was used in there. And so interestingly enough, how that kind of comes in to where, all of this kind of comes together, right? To try to say that. There's also one of the interesting things I think too, is that even though as Maya comes to terms with what she's bringing to the town, there's danger following her, right? Mm-hmm. The danger that's following her at this point is her fighting, obviously, against this force. The interesting thing is that the danger, number one, is coming from someone else because he doesn't have to chase her, right? That's one part of it. I guess obviously she doesn't have to re-engage and fight too, except for the fact for survival. But when she gets there, we've got her friend Henry, played by Chask Spencer, who, just kills it, like I think he always does. And he's sucked into that life as well. All of this, like, there is this crime presence in the town that it does go back to Kingpin, right? That he is running it just like he runs all crime in the MCU. But it goes back to him eventually. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's this blame that she has accepted on her shoulders of like, I've brought this violence. When it's like, no, the violence has already been brought to the community. You know, it gets stirred up certainly in this, but I don't know. I have just some thoughts about
that's that whole thing about like how, again, that engagement, like how do we got no choice but to engage with this, or we've been sucked into it, and it's how they manage to keep it off to the side and keep it out of the daily life and the whatever, where it's just, again, that we don't talk. And again, think about that in terms of overall coping mechanisms. We don't talk about this. We don't do whatever. We don't. And so, and again, I think about, like, for example, again, in terms of my background, one of the things that I did was and it was an interesting thing. It was, I taught a lot of Indigenous students and classes that were either entirely Indigenous or mixes of Indigenous and other folks from marginalized communities. So you had a lot of discussion about privilege and experience. And in some case, you know, what was it like for these folks to be colonized and their ancestry here versus somebody else that might have been colonized in another part of the world but was coming here. And so anyways, all these different things, but what you would go back to, and as you were working your way through this history, I had a lot of students for whom I was giving them their history in a way that, in a sense, they didn't know. They had no, that they were just living with the immediate impact of, this is what my parents are like, what my grandparents, what my community is like, and not necessarily knowing all the steps. And you would have these moments where it's, oh, aha, okay, now I understand why grandma is like this, or and maybe it might be something about when the community was relocated, or maybe it had to do with residential schools or the 60s scoop or something. And this was that kind of thing that I saw with her, was what we were getting that history, and you're seeing those moments of where somebody gets sucked in, but they had that same kind of thing where it's like oh, this is my fault. I've done something wrong. I got sucked into this, as opposed to, oh, wait a minute. No, I'm just the culmination, or I am one of a series. And the fact that the family doesn't talk about this, or grandma never said X, so therefore nobody really knew. We just knew that grandma was like this, as opposed to, oh, here's the thing, put it in context, and then. But and so that's what I sort of felt with the crime, was that was one of those things, again, the representative of, oh, we just don't talk about that thing, and that your knowledge of your own sort of history is that, you know, curated, and often curated by just whole wax of omission.
Well, and on that other side too, right? You look at the education that the history of white colonizers interacting. I mean, I grew up very much in a day. Well, I feel like in some ways it's better now, and in some ways it's worse. We still have the internet and Google, and some educators try to get real history across. Here in the U.S., we have a lot of people trying to pass laws against telling real history if it makes white people feel bad. That's literally that's the
trickling up here. We've got our own, you know, the Kool-Aid is flowing over the 49th.
You don't want white kids to be uncomfortable. Or as I read, Michael Harriot, who's a writer about a lot of Black American history, said we actually need more uncomfortable white children if the next generation is going to change, right? There's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable if it's uncomfortable about the truth and wanting to do something about it. But you look at the history as it was taught when I was growing up, is very much like, oh, the traditional Thanksgiving where we're all sitting down and breaking bread together, and the stories. And I won't hit the specific ones or whatever, just the characters, and a lot of times as you discover the mythology around certain, you know, like native characters in more fictionalized history, who were the ones, they were the good guys. They showed up to help the white people, and isn't that there? And amazing how much we just kind of swallow that and say, oh yeah, of course. And then you stop and think for a few minutes when you're challenged on that to say, well, is that, wait, hold on. How come you're the good guys only if you brought, you know, showed us how to put fish and with seeds or something, and you helped people who were not qualified to come over and take, anyway, but you know, just to see that dearth. And I feel like some of these stories, and we've seen it in some of the movies, and particularly though with the TV series in this phase, some people have said this phase of Marvel, the TV miniseries and series that they're putting out there has been the shining stars, to where they're actually telling some of these stories. to the point where obnoxious people online say things like, well, didn't we already do this with Black Panther? And it's like, no, we didn't do a story of indigenous people written by indigenous people in a Native American sentence in Black Panther.
Exactly, because anybody that's not white is just other, and they all had the exact same experience.
Right, exactly.
And,
there's such an assumption that happens. And I literally saw when I was reading articles for this, prepping for this episode, I do sometimes prep people, believe it or not, as you know, evidence would maybe indicate not. But as I was reading that, there were some people that were saying that kind of stupid bullshit, but somebody even said like, well, look at Captain America, you know, he didn't come from a cultural perspective. And it's like, that's such a white is default. White American is the default culture. So there's no culture encompassed in that. And it's like, maybe you need to sort of just educate yourself on your own and elements of that if you feel that way. But anyway, I don't want to fight that battle here because I really do believe, I think most of the listeners of this show probably aren't in that crowd. And if you are, take a long, hard look. Anyway, but
it's validation for those of the fans that are like, okay, so I'm not the lone voice in the wilderness amidst the toxic fandom.
Exactly.
Like, so we're that safe place here for you.
So
You're like,
that's
okay.
here. That's here. And I'd be shocked if people were like, he doesn't agree with that. But at least if you've heard any episodes before. So, but to really... one of the things that's really important to that is to say this is also stories that are being told by people who are members of that community. And being invited in as a viewer. And this is something, as you know, I'm a white, straight, het, cis dude, right? And so for me to feel invited into some of this cultural things that are told by storytellers who are part of that culture is such a welcoming thing, and also just such a good education for me, for my children, you know, all that.
And it's where it belongs, because like I said, like, again, I think back to my own teaching background. And I mean, I still remember moving back to Manitoba after going around to different universities and coming back. And the first job that I got hired for was to teach. It had to do with a memorandum of understanding here. And it was about basically teaching the Intro Native Studies course to 36 Indigenous social workers. And so there's nothing like walking into that class and going, okay, so, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk about just how weird this is, that the privilege of this lily white, borderline translucent, I have no pigment. It's all in my hair. My eyebrow, like brown hair, and see-through otherwise. And let's just talk about the fact that even though, you know, coming from a working class background, that my privilege as such, basically allowed me access to certain things. And I've got this education, and I basically, as I told my students, consider me your secret decoder ring. But this is the starting point for this conversation. How messed up is it that? And that I said, my goal was to literally teach my way out of a job. And that the idea being that and what was brilliant about it in the end was that, I got recruited out into politics, and sure enough, watched all of the jobs that I had. You know, people are like, you know, why don't you go back to your old job? I'm like, because there are Indigenous women teaching these classes.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And it was the same thing with coming into office, where we did not have an Indigenous woman there. And I ended up being like okay, I get it. You know, I'm not speaking for anyone, but I'm just saying that my friends, my sisters, this is not what they would, you know, want. This is just bringing this perspective to the table. And then we were able to recruit some Indigenous women in, and now again, strong representation. But it was that, like, I feel weird that I have to be a placeholder and bring this stuff in because nobody else is bringing it in. But how I'm looking at it is, if I can stick my toe in the door, and somebody's going to let my white, toe prop the door open, then I'm going to swing that door open and let all those other people who you kept slamming the door in, I'm letting them barge through. Might start off as a trickle, but it's that. And I think that's what I loved about this, and again, that evolution of the MCU and what you're talking about with the TV shows. I mean, we started off with Iron Man. I mean, on one, like literally, especially at that stage of his life, the poster boy for everything, like masculine, toxic, unhealed, whatever. And then you watch that evolve, and then the MCU evolves, and then you get that exploration into characters like Black Panther and Shuri. And again, what do we see changing in terms of directors, writers there? And now we're having that with an Indigenous context as well. And so to see that they actually worked with the Choctaw, and that was even part of, I think that's the other part that folks out in the fandom need to realize, that it wasn't just about, we've decided to drop this culture so that we can say we're rebooting it. There was active work to reach out and literally find a community that was going to support this, not just because, we need to film on your lands or something because, blah, 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 blah. It was no. We want your input. We need you to shape this story. We need you to be good with it. And we will, again, we know what we want to do in the broader sense, but you're going to help us make sure that, first of all, that works, that's authentic. And then you're going to give us all of those details so that we can highlight your culture and not just inform this character, but give an authentic snapshot of things to represent it. So I think that was the other part that to me was really important. It wasn't just like somebody, went and looked up, the encyclopedia of indigenous North America and went, okay, let's, hey, we just placed so many people into Oklahoma. There's got to be somebody in Oklahoma.
There's an important difference, I think, is what you're bringing out. This important difference of trying to actually empower people. And it's interesting how I'm going to use the Kingpin as an analogy for this, although I don't know that he falls into this category. So I'll just say it this way. White liberals and those of us who might say, I'm an ally, and look at what I'm doing. I'm trying to be an ally. I'm trying to do this and all that. I think the traps that we need to watch out for are traps where that entitlement bleeds through. And so people like to throw out these terms like white saviorism, or they throw out terms like virtue signaling. And even though I think the problem with those is they're weaponized for people to accuse anyone who's trying to help of lift anyone up. But I think the real pitfall of that is when people fall into I'm here to empower people in the sense of like, I'm going to do for them. But then when they want to do something different or they have ideas, the real difference that makes it empowerment, I think what you're talking about is saying not only someone invited in and it's like, we got one in the room, so to speak. Yep. Sorry to be crass, but that's the way sometimes white politics play out, right? In business as well as governmental politics and in entertainment. But to actually say, now you got the floor, we're going to listen. I'm going to go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. And how many sort of white liberal friends of mine that I've, surprise, have on social media, I've seen several people that have hit this point where they're like, well, what more do they want about some group? When it's like, well, that made me uncomfortable. Well, hey, well, hold on, don't say that. I don't like that very much. And it's like, well, that really puts it to the test of how much you're willing to confront your entitlement.
Well, and that's exactly it. And one of the things that would, again, often come up in the classroom would be this thing of, again, misunderstandings around, for example, what kind of funding or where funding came from, or, well, blah, 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 they're entitled to a free education. And you're like, oh, it's not that simple. People are not mailing them, tuition checks and this and that. And there's complicated layers. This is not just, and for the handful of folks that finally get through it after jumping through all like whatever, it's again, there's no money train here or whatever else. And so it was confronting a lot of those things, or like, well, my life it wasn't easy. And it's like, yeah, but you know what? The one thing you never had against you was your skin color. If you were a white working class person. And that was the other thing in terms of, again, like I said, that weirdness of coming into this. Like, I mean, I started down this path of studying this because it was basically, I wanted to learn what was around me. It was I enjoyed studying culture and this and these different things, but it's like, well, I'm not going to go do the typical anthropology thing, that's the sort of the anthrotrope, you learn this and then you go to the other side of the world and study the exotic other. It's like, no. I'm learning stuff that, huge historic things literally happened within a stone's throw of where I was born and raised. And I'm didn't know about it until I was in university. And not, because somebody actively taught it. It's like I inadvertently dug it up as part of research. And you're like, what? Wait a minute. We should be teaching every kid, in grade 8 this. Why am I, only stumbling across this now in my 20s? And so it was that thing where even coming into that role as teaching, that was part of that discussion, was that understanding of I'm teaching you what I have learned that's part of this Western system. This is what we know. And we're going to talk about and tear apart these different things. And oh, by the way, I'm also bringing in elders because I want you to see both sides. And then we had those discussions around even elders that had been Christianized, that had and again, conversion and what that had done to traditional teachings and these kinds of things. And, and that's where, again, I think I love Chula because that character reminded me. I think that's the other part, that her and Scully, those characters reminded me so much of the elders that I have known, that I've had the honor to learn from, and that I've, been able to bring into the classroom, where there's that understanding of the pain, the suffering, but then also the humor and the connection and that sense of family, and being able to take something and see it from a healing perspective, not denying the pain, the suffering, but to be able to say, but this is how we get over it, we get through it, or this is why we do what we do. And again, I think we never really find out, we know that Chula is her grandmother. We don't know if Scully is grandpa, or if that's just somebody that she's been involved in, long-term relationship with.
That's a good point.
So we don't know if he's actually grandpa, and again, because that biology, that doesn't matter in a sense. He is her grandfather in a larger symbolic relationship kind of way. And that for whatever distance, it was not acrimonious divorce. I mean, again, there was obviously they get up in each other's business, but you could also see in that bickering, that was, again, not the toxic kind of fighting that you saw in, Kingpin's upbringing. These were two people that there's still some thread of love, and it's almost like and so with every little poke, I mean, the fact that he'd saved her sewing machine and things like all of these other different things and their conversations, those two, that it was almost like they love each other, but at some point realized they couldn't live with each other. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing where right. I love you, but you got to stay over there. You do that. I'm going to do this. But, he'd fixed her sewing machine. It was sitting there. He never pawned it. There was those kinds of relationship things that were there that, again, speak to what I know of, what I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to in terms of the, indigenous people and communities that have let me into their world and what I was able to see. But it was always with that understanding that I'm just a facilitator, an interloper. And every year I always said to my students, I've learned more from you than I'm sure I taught you. And I've taught you a lot, but you've taught me more because of what you bring. And I'm going to feed that back into what I do. But like I said, the goal for me is to get the heck out of this classroom, because I don't belong here the way an Indigenous instructor belongs here, and who I feel can better negotiate that walking in two worlds. And that if anything, my role is to, again, as a non-Indigenous person, fine, let me work with other non-Indigenous people because I can speak their language, see what their hangups are, and then bring them to this point. So I'm going to, I'm going to do reverse conversion. I'm going to, let's, check your privilege. Here's the stuff that we've been collectively gaslit to think that we're better. Here's how we shed this baggage and heal. And I think going back to our original point with the vengeance thing, she starts off with vengeance and she goes through all these different things. What does she do to Kingpin in the end?
This is key. And
she goes and she heals.
Yeah. Yes.
And there are different, again, stories, mythologies, whatever you want to call it, different teachings that the idea is within Indigenous cultures, that the idea is that the Indigenous cultures see, white culture as, those are the young ones that came in, where this is the older culture, and that they will eventually help heal the young ones. And they're there to teach. So for all the garbage that's been brought over, we're going to eventually overcome this, and we're going to help them heal. And so to me, that was that teaching embodied in Echo, that she was the echo of the generations trying to heal the toxic colonizer.
And I felt like there was such a powerful thing here. Obviously, from a narrative perspective, they're not done with Kingpin, so they don't want to kill him.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's what. But so there's that. But I did think in the idea of her, she doesn't. Well, let's put it this way: she scares him away, but in a completely different way than he doesn't understand it. Going back to, he understood being shot, but he doesn't understand someone wanting to. And we have yet to see, and I guess I can only assume as we move forward that we'll see how much or if this impacts who he is. It impacted him enough that he had to get out of there. He's like, out of here. And apparently now wants to be mayor. I don't know. But whatever, the end credits, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, God. Yeah. Just the guy we need in that kind of decision-making role. What could possibly go wrong?
But, no, but the fact that they chose to do that, in a way, it has more to do with her than him. Like, sure, it is a service for him, I guess, to be healed. But from that perspective,
it's part of her own healing.
Exactly. It has much more to do with her and that moment with her mother, and that healing of saying, what you have been doing, not only do you not have to do it anymore, and not only can you be redeemed or forgiven for being part of this bad, gang life or whatever, criminal life, but you are better than that. You transcend. She transcends it.
Yeah.
It's not just like, yeah, we'll go ahead, we'll redeem you, we'll forgive you kind of thing. It's like trying to actually transcend that. The other thing that it reminded me of, something that is very effective that's been used. I mean, you see this in Captain Marvel at the end, where it's like, I'm not threatened by this person anymore. Right?
Yes.
There's a freedom from being afraid, because if you're afraid, you'd take him out somehow or something. You try to,
You'd still be going on the vengeance. Yeah. Because
exactly.
it's him or me.
Yes. And here is like, nah, I am going to do this instead. Right. Do this instead of that. Yeah.
And thank you for putting that way in terms of, because it wasn't about, I'm going to go heal him, because it's that idea that it was for her own healing and her own closure. So she's on this path, she's growing, and this is the one thing that I've turned now from needing vengeance on you for closure, because that's your way of doing things. And I thought it was the way to do things, but now I'm doing my own thing, and I'm doing this. I would honestly say in some respects more for her than for him, in the sense that this is what she needed to do. And this was, in terms of building and repairing and doing, growing these other, relationships that had been on the back burner. This was one of those. And now I got to do this. And I think it's an interesting one, especially from a trauma perspective, because it represents a layer where, like, not all of us that, when somebody has traumatized you, and if they're continuing on the path that they're on, the notion of doing anything like that it's just, in some cases, it's just literally not possible because of the risk that it puts you at. But it's that idea that in some cases it can happen, or that it represents, that, again, sometimes I think we do it more and symbolically, maybe, that where it's that, again, I got to cut you out of my life. I got to do this. But I'm not going to talk behind your back. I'm not going to, rattle off all the things. I'm going to, it even gets into that complicated world of, forgiving someone. And you're like, you're not forgiving them in the sense of, they came to you with an apology. They actively did something. And like, how do I forgive someone? No. This is about, I get it. You're a hurt person. You got your own stuff to deal with. You did this out of your pain, but I don't need this anymore. So I see that. And I acknowledge where it came from, but bye-bye, I can't be part of it. And so I think in some respects, she got to do physically, or maybe metaphysically, what most folks can't do in the real world for their own healing. And I think that's an interesting metaphor or something to think about.
Very, very much so. I find that from a clinical or psychological therapy perspective, if people even want to use the word forgiveness, which I always like to point out they don't have to, but the idea of what is the definition that is something that people probably, as part of their healing, I always like to define it as trying to get to a point where the anger and the fear don't have to determine the decisions I make or how I feel about myself. That to me is the healthiest version of that. The idea that I have to, and this is certainly a spiritual thing for a lot of people, and not to diminish the power of this, but the idea that I have to release, and for the other person, forgive them as I would want, all that. That can be a great healing thing for some people, but there's not like research that says everyone has to do that to be a healthy person. Right?
Exactly. And
that's
I
why
kind
I
of
like that
more from the Buddhist perspective, where it's the whole idea of like holding on to anger is like holding on to a hot stone, with the idea that you're going to throw it at the enemy. And it's like, well, for the most part, you're the only one that ends up guaranteed with a burnt hand, right? you know,
and it has
because you could eventually throw it, but it's probably going to be cooler, and there's no guarantee it's going to hit them. But in the meantime, you burnt your hand on the hot stone, so just put the thing down, and that's that kind of thing there. Where exactly, like it's a word that's definitely like laden with other meanings and context, but it's that sense of what did she need to do to heal, and again, it puts something into his head. We'll see where it goes, But again, in light of what we know already, it's going to be something that, like you said, he's cool with being shot in the eye, but God forbid you should do something healthy. That's scarier. So, come at me with an AK-47, but God forbid you give me hugs and, a 10-pack at a therapy, 10-pack therapy session.
That's if you think about it, it's a pretty intense therapy session. That's even more intense than Mobius's first meeting with Loki. Let's be honest. Yeah. As far as therapy sessions that have played out in the MCU. Well, in fact, hey, that would be an interesting episode. All the therapy that's you got the DBT and She-Hulk, you got the couples counseling and the Falcon and the anyway. Yeah, that's a good little way here for free. Everybody's got to
make a note. Another rabbit hole for us to go down. Psychotherapy in the MCU.
Well, let's throw out. We might keep talking here and move on, but let's go ahead and cap this one off. I want to let everybody know some things that they can follow and look up. What's the best way currently for them to follow your work with mental health advocacy trainings?
Well, I have been taking a little bit of my own sort of mental health pause. Check in on speak-up.co, speak-up.co, and I'm hopefully going to be getting some new stuff back up there. But needed to sort of take my own break, and actually very thankful for actually being able to fall down some Marvel and BTS rabbit holes of late. There's been ample content, and we've been talking about a lot of it. So, and family time, because I have a little Spider Ben grandson, because breed nerds. Grandson named after a character.
Watching. By the way, I can't remember how old he is. How old is Ben?
He is going to be turning 3 in February, and he is built like a little tank. And he's. He
might be a little young for Moon Girl, but everybody should know that Moon Girl, the animated series, just came out for its 2nd season, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Well, we live in the wonderful world of Bluey, which is again an awesome super healthy show, and is weirdly addictive. And there's nothing stranger than babysitting them, occasionally throwing an episode on, and then they leave, and you're like, I've watched another 4 Bluey episodes.
Oh, I'll say, when my youngest
and it's only 4 episodes in, you realize you're still watching it.
Yes. Take her to bed, just, hit, unpause the TV and go forward, and it's just still Bluey.
But again, I'm glad to see that kind of stuff is there.
Awesome. Well, I'll throw out there too, I'm encouraging everybody just to kind of try to check out my website. I'm trying a couple different things on there at dwighthurst.com, and you can find ways to kind of get involved to support the program. I'm also I'm experimenting with a couple of different things on there. I'd love people's feedback about different ways to fundraise directly for therapy clients that I see. If there are, you can certainly do that by contributing to the show, but there are also some very specific things I'm doing where 100% of anything that you can either straight up donate, or you can I'm making a little page where you can buy photography or art or things, or there's some different things if you choose to purchase that the money will go directly towards either offsetting the cost or completely covering sessions of therapy for people, for those who have insurance changes or those who have a basic need Anyway, so I'm just kind of setting up some of those things, and over this next year, I'd like to network. If anybody out there, by the way, knows of therapists who do pro bono work here and there, those of us in private practice, we're a little limited in how much we can afford to do that. And so I'm really interested in people's solutions with how they're finding that to be that kind of to express that kind of ethic of access to treatment for people who might not otherwise. So a little long-winded there, but I encourage people to check that out. There's also bonus materials and some writing and some things like that, a lot of which is available just for free, and then some of which is going to be for patrons as well. Just that's an ever-evolving thing, and I encourage people to just every morning when you get up, go to my website as your and then Sharon's, and both of them. That's your morning dose of mental health. Anyway, thank you, Sharon, for talking about Echo, and we will.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be back at everybody again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtamparts.com.